Something unusual happened in Washington over the last day, and almost nobody is talking about it the right way. The people who spent months fighting against the Clarity Act just started backing it instead. You're watching Coin Crusader, and this shift might matter more than any price chart this week. For most of this year, law enforcement groups were one of the biggest roadblocks standing between the Clarity Act and a Senate vote. That resistance just cracked, and the timing of it is not an accident. Here's what actually happened. The National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, known as NOBLE, became the first major policing organization to publicly back the bill. Their reasoning was simple. They said the legislation gives investigators new tools without touching the criminal authorities they already rely on.
But that wasn't the only development.
The Major County Sheriffs of America, a group representing law enforcement across the country's biggest counties, moved from open opposition to a neutral position. That happened after direct conversations with the White House about a specific section of the bill. Then things accelerated even further. 4 more law enforcement associations, representing prosecutors, federal attorneys, and police chiefs across the country, also softened their stance. That's not one organization changing its mind. That's a pattern forming. Here's where things start getting interesting. These groups were never against crypto regulation as a concept. Their concern was narrower. They worried the bill might weaken tools used to fight money laundering and unlicensed money transmission. Once they got confirmation those tools stay intact, the opposition started melting away. At first glance, this looks like a technical footnote, but step back and the bigger picture becomes clear. Odds of the Clarity Act becoming law jumped from below 40% to just above 50% almost overnight, based on prediction markets tracking the bill. That raises an entirely different question. If law enforcement is no longer the obstacle, what actually is? The honest answer right now is politics, not policy. Democratic lawmakers still have unresolved concerns about ethics language connected to conflicts of interest tied to the current administration's crypto ventures. That single issue is now the last real barrier between this bill and a floor vote. If it gets resolved, the legislation has a clear runway to reach the Senate before lawmakers leave for the August recess. The timeline itself tells a story. Compromise text was expected to circulate over the holiday weekend. Senators return in mid-July, but they have defense legislation to handle first. Only after that clears does the Clarity Act get real floor time. This is the part most people are missing. Analysts at Bloomberg Intelligence have pegged the odds of passage this year at roughly 60%, while other research desks have trimmed their estimate closer to 50%. Neither number suggests certainty. Both suggest this is genuinely close. To understand why this matters for XRP specifically, you have to look at who benefits from regulatory clarity. Analysts tracking Ripple's positioning argue that the most heavily regulated crypto companies stand to gain the largest share of new business once rules are finalized. That's because banks, payment processors, and financial institutions tend to move toward whichever infrastructure already meets compliance standards. Ripple has spent years building exactly that kind of regulatory posture, long before this bill existed. Here's a detail worth sitting with. Before the Genius Act passed earlier this year, most traditional banks treated crypto regulation as background noise. Industry insiders describe major banking lobbyists as largely absent from early policy discussions, only showing up once legislation started moving. That pattern could repeat. If the Clarity Act passes, expect a similar wave of institutions suddenly paying attention to infrastructure providers they previously ignored. Ripple's positioning across prime brokerage, tokenization, and cross-border payment rails puts it in a position to absorb that attention. But this isn't a story about instant fireworks. Passing a bill and implementing its rules are 2 very different timelines. Historically, regulatory frameworks take anywhere from 12 to 24 months before agencies fully translate legislation into enforceable rules. That means the immediate market reaction to a passed bill could look underwhelming compared to the long-term structural shift underneath it. Some analysts even warn this could turn into a sell the news event, where prices react to anticipation more than to the actual signing. Then another detail adds weight to all of this. Analysts who've spent time studying markets across Asia point out that if the United States stalls, other governments won't wait. Countries like South Korea and jurisdictions like Hong Kong have reportedly been positioning their own frameworks in case American legislation fails to materialize. That introduces a competitive angle most retail investors aren't factoring in. This isn't just about whether America regulates crypto. It's about whether America regulates crypto before other major economies build the infrastructure to attract that business first. And this is where the story splits into two possible paths. One path leads to a resolved ethics dispute, a floor vote before August, and a signed bill that slowly reshapes how institutions engage with assets like XRP over the next 2 years. The other path leads to stalled negotiations, a bill that slips past this congressional session, and a scenario where global competitors move first, forcing Washington to play catch-up on its own turf. Right now, both outcomes remain genuinely possible. Law enforcement stepping aside removed one obstacle. It didn't remove all of them.
The real story may not be what happened with law enforcement this week.
The real story is whether Washington can resolve its own internal disagreements before the rest of the world stops waiting for permission.